Gestalt psychology. So I thought initially Gestalt was a person, and the Gestalt psychology was attributed to the person who might have done this kind of study, right? But it's not. It's actually a school of thought, and some of you guys might have heard this before. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That is Gestalt psychology's motto, if you will, or main message. If you could sum it up in something, it would be that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so what that means is that the brain doesn't process little pieces of information at one time. The brain automatically organizes them into meaningful patterns. And essentially what it's doing is trying to understand the principles that govern how we organize sensory information and then turn them into meaningful experiences. And I know that sounds very, very dense, but it'll make more sense here in the next couple slides. And if you're anything like me, I had a hard time pronouncing this the correct way. So I thought it was Gestalt, because I want to say it the way it looks, but it's Gestalt, and it's German, but Google helped me with that. So again, the main focus here is that Gestalt psychology wanted to veer from the idea that things are experienced or perceived in isolated details or atom-like stimuli, and instead it's more about patterns and structures and relationships and contexts. So that is, if you can hold on to that, everything will make sense. So our textbook introduces 3 men who contributed a lot into Gestalt psychology, and so we have Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kolfka, and Wolfgang Köhler. These 3 men really challenged the molecular approach to psychology that we were introduced to in the first couple chapters of our book. And if you recall, the molecular approach to psychology looks at the attempt to reduce complex phenomena into small units for detailed study. And so what they were trying to justify was that our brain does not perceive things in that way as individual parts, but instead it looks for patterns. Max, Kurt, and Wolfgang came up with principles to help focus on perception and cognition to explain what they mean. And so we have principles of continuity, proximity, inclusiveness, similarity, and closure. If you look at the law of continuity, what it says is that it's the tendency to experience stimuli that follows some predictable pattern as a perceptual unit. And all that means is that our minds want to say that this will continue a path. So our brain is basically putting more dots and saying this continues forever, this type of squiggly line. The other one that I want to point out is the law of closure. So here in this example, we have like a diamond, but really it's just a bunch of lines, but our brain wants to complete those and make it into one singular shape. And that law of closure says it's the tendency to perceive incomplete objects as complete. The law or principle of similarity is the tendency to perceive as unit stimuli that are physically similar to one another. The law or principle of proximity is the tendency to perpetually group together stimuli that are physically close. And so we see this as one group of 3 dots by 8, and then we see another group that are 3 dots by 8. No one is telling us that that's how they're grouped, but our brain says these are two separate groups. Principle of inclusiveness states that elements enclosed by a common boundary are perceived as a single entity. Grouping related elements together using visual cues such as borders, backgrounds, or colors. And we're going to move on to my favorite idea or concept of Gestalt psychology, and that's figure-ground relationship. And that's defined as the most basic type of perception, consisting of division of perceptual field into a figure and a ground, which provides the background for the figure. All that means is our brain wants to make sense of something. Our brain will look for what makes sense. And so here's a great example. Okay, so in this first photo, do you see a woman or a saxophone player? And depending on what you make the ground or the background and what is the figure that pops up to you, you basically are trying to get your brain's trying to figure it out. And if you make that switch in your brain of what's the figure and what's the ground, you can see two different images. Now, this next one, is it a vase? If we look at if the background, we make the background black, do you see the white vase? Now, what if we make the background white? Do you see two men about to kiss? Next one. This one's a little tricky. I think most of us have seen this in our childhood. Do you see a young lady or do you see an old lady in this first photo? And if you can't see the young lady, it's almost as if she's turning her head away and we see just her profile and she's got like this hat on. And then the old lady, what would be the jawline of the young lady is now becoming the nose of the old lady, and she's kind of looking down, and what would have been the necklace or part of the shirt for the young lady now is like the mouth of the old lady. And instead of a hat, she almost has like a what are those things called, like a shawl over her head. You see that? Okay, this one, do you see three Pac-Mans or Pac-Men, or do you see a triangle? This next one is one of my favorites. Do you see a duck or do you see a rabbit? And this is same type of idea of figure-ground relationship. It's really just your brain trying to make sense of what it's looking at, depending on what you focus on. So some issues that people have had with Gestalt psychology is that it's hard to test and it lacks falsifiability. Basically people are like, okay, prove it. And it's hard to prove. It's hard to do experiments on this and replicate them and say, yes, this is what's happening in the brain. And so they've gotten some backlash because of that. One of the articles that I read that were dissecting and critically analyzing Gestalt psychology, they said that in a laudable effort at originality, they have blinded themselves to all ideas akin to their own, which antedated their coming, and to all uncomfortable facts thereafter, thus violating one of the first canons of exact scholarship. Basically, what this diss is saying is that Gestalt psychology tried too hard to be original. That's all that. That's a really long way to say you try too hard to be original. And other critics have said that the whole concept of it is way too abstract for any practical application. So it's like, okay, cool, you guys discovered this. You guys have explained the obvious in a way, but now what? What do we do with this? So that's some critiques that they have put on this school of thought. Okay, so let's switch our focus to why is it important? And so it definitely has shifted views on perception, problem solving, and learning. It basically put words to a phenomena that would happen in our brains before anyone has been able to say this is what's happening. So it put words to something that happens naturally when we look at things. There was a research done between perception and decision making. And so basically they wanted to see if there was similarities between those two. So what they found was that the research linked Gestalt's proximity law with the attraction effect in choices, suggesting that the brain applies common rules across perception and decision making. What does that mean? Basically, what they're saying is the research showed that the brain is more unified than we thought, and that how we see the world affects how we choose in the world. And so it really just kind of found that link of how we see it is how we choose it. In some other facets where Gestalt psychology is important, has some contributions into cognitive psychology, neuroscience, therapy, and design. And so if I could summarize the importance of Gestalt psychology, it would be that it has contributed to education and learning, and it has shown that humans and animals learn and act in terms of wholes, relationships, and goals, and not just isolated parts or isolated stimuli. And really, it just offered a fresh way to look at things and give more definition to what our brains are doing when we perceive. So yeah, that is Gestalt psychology.